Good afternoon. Welcome to NeoConnect 2020. NeoConnect is NeoCon's online series of resources, programming, and events designed to connect the community throughout the month of June. I'm Blair Lofspring, Managing Director of Leasing and Marketing for LuxeHome, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Today's session, presented by LuxeHome, is part of a month-long series of CEU webinars hosted by NeoCon. The session is approved for one IDCEC credit for interior designers and one AIA LU for architects. You can find details on CEU credits at the bottom of your screen or at neocon.com. Questions will be answered at the end of the session. Please feel free to add any questions you have during the session to the Q&A icon at the top or bottom of the screen. Our speaker will do his best to answer as many questions as possible in the time allotted. Today's presentation is Designing with Tile. In this session, our speaker, Scott Conwell, FAIA FCSI Lead AP, will unveil some of the recent trends and changes in tile design. The session will address design and installation requirements for both conventional and large format tile, including substrate preparation and floor flatness standards. Attendees will also develop an understanding of various types of tile, cutting methods, system components, as well as quality assurance methods as outlined in the ANSI A108 standards in the Tile Council of North America handbook. Scott Conwell is an architect and the Director of Industry Development within the International Masonry Institute, a nonprofit trade association where he is responsible for tile, marble, and terrazzo programs. He has been with the IMI for 25 years. He currently sits on the Tile Council of North America Handbook Committee and the ANSI Committee for Tile Standards. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and also a fellow of the Construction Specifications Institute. Scott will present on the topic of designing with tile. Please join me in welcoming Scott Conwell.
All right, thank you very much, Blair. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. Welcome to my basement of my house. Let's jump right in. Blair told you a little bit about my professional background. I briefly want to tell you who the organization is that I am affiliated with and that I work for, and that is the International Masonry Institute. We are a nonprofit organization, and we are responsible for well, really two things: the apprenticeship and training of the bricklayers and allied craft workers. And in this case, the craft of ceramic tile and marble and terrazzo and stone masonry these are all allied crafts of the bricklaying trade. And today we're going to talk about tile and designing with tile and installing tile. So I wanted you to be aware that the IMI is the training and apprenticeship arm of the union that is responsible for training and installing tile. So let us jump right in. We have a lot of ground to cover, and if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat window. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about the codes and standards that we work with every day as architects and designers and contractors. Primarily, we're going to talk about the ANSI standards and the Tile Council of North America methods. I also want to acknowledge the International Building Code, because this is the model code in the whole United States that governs many aspects of what we do. The IBC doesn't have a whole lot to say about tile, but it does have something to say about exterior adhered porcelain tile, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Then we jump to the ANSI standards. There are a whole family of ANSI standards that talk about materials, the tile materials, the ancillary materials in the system, that is to say the setting materials, the grouts, the membranes, and the installation of those materials. So we have ANSI A137.1, which addresses the tiles themselves. ANSI A108 is the installation standard. Now, one of the things about tile is it's a system, and it's great to think about how how durable is the tile and how pretty is the tile and what's the size and what does it look like, because that's the finished material. But you have to remember, it's a complex system, and everything underneath the tile is very, very important, whether it's a wall or a floor or an overhead condition. So the A108 series of ANSI standards addresses the system, and we'll get into that as we go forward. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about this new category of tile called gauged porcelain tile and gauged porcelain tile panels. These are the ultra large format, in many cases, very, very thin tile panels. And I'll be showing some examples of those and talking also about some unique characteristics in terms of the standards. And for those of you familiar with tile, you probably are aware of the Tile Council of North America Handbook, or the TCNA Handbook. It used to be called the TCA many years ago, the Tile Council of America, and now we're the Tile Council of North America. And the handbook now covers not only ceramic tile, but also glass tile and stone tile, and it will be covering gauged porcelain tile. So the handbook is a really good reference. And I will, toward the end of my presentation, I will talk a little bit about what Master Spec has to say about specifically installer qualifications for those individuals installing tile. So that's the real quick rundown of what the standards are. And I just wanted you to be aware of what the reference material is and where most of the material in this presentation comes from. And we have those in the form of a kind of a snapshot, a one-page quick reference. And if you want me to send you a copy of this quick reference PDF, you can email me. My contact info is on the screen, and it's also on the title slide when we go back to it. So you might wonder, well, who are these people who make the ANSI standards, who write the ANSI standards? It's about a 61-person committee coming from all over the industry, and the breakdown is like you see on the slide. Primarily, it's manufacturers. They represent the greatest interest, and there's also contractors under the category of labor, end users in general. I'm on the committee for the ANSI standards. I'm on the committee for the Tile Council Handbook. It's a consensus-based organization, so we meet generally twice a year, and we debate all things related to tile. So there we have codes and standards. So now let me jump into something that may be a little bit more relatable to most of you. And by the way, I should have started off by thanking the folks at NeoCon and the folks at LuxeHome for hosting this presentation. I want to talk briefly. So speaking of NeoCon and LuxeHome, these are the suppliers who really provide material that is just amazing, and we'll talk a little bit about material right now. So let's talk about different categories of tile, and we look to ANSI A137.1 to create some very definitive categories. So looking at the ANSI standards, we have these categories of porcelain tile, pressed floor tile, mosaic tile, quarry tile, and glazed wall tile. Those are the main categories of ceramic tile. Ceramic tile is this broad descriptor. Porcelain, for example, is a subset of ceramic, right? So porcelain tile is always a ceramic tile, but ceramic tile is not always a porcelain tile. What makes a tile a porcelain tile? I'll tell you in a few minutes. Now, the Tile Council Handbook also covers all of the above, and in addition, it also covers glass tile, natural stone tile, and this new thing, well, it's not so new anymore, but it's newish, gauged porcelain and gauged porcelain panels. We can classify a tile based on many different criteria, based on size, based on composition, based on hardness, based on scratch resistance, based on porosity or absorption, based on the type of edges that the tile has. And these are all important physical criteria of tile. I'm going to single out absorption categories because I do get a lot of questions on what's so special about porcelain tile. So I'm going to quickly go over the absorption categories, and we don't have a whole hour to talk about tiles themselves, but this will be some of the high points. So there are 4 categories of absorption in the ANSI standards, beginning with the hardest and most non-absorptive category, and that would be the impervious category. So impervious tiles have a moisture absorption of less than 0.5% moisture. And porcelain tile is an example of impervious tile. Glass tile is another example of an impervious tile. In the next category, we have the vitreous category. That's 0.5% to 3%. Pressed floor tile. Most of the 12 by 12 red body tiles or hard-fired ceramic tile that is more absorptive than a porcelain would fall into the vitreous category. In semi-vitreous, the range is 3 to 7%, and that's a pretty big range. That's where the quarry tile and some of the softer ceramic tiles fall into. And then non-vitreous would be glazed wall tile. These would be very soft white body tile that you wouldn't want to walk on, but they're okay for backsplashes and walls and things like that. In terms of edge categories, I draw this to your attention because we're going to talk about grout joint width and what type of tile can you get thinner grout joints with. And it has to do with the type of edge. So there are rectified edge tiles and then there are calibrated tiles. The difference is that rectified tiles have crisper edges and straighter and more predictable and more exacting edges because they've been cut after they've been fired. Okay, whereas calibrated tiles, the raw materials are batched and mixed and pressed or extruded, usually pressed, and then they're heated in the kiln, and then they go through the drying process and the glazing, etc. And then they're not cut, they're hard, and they're already hard after they're fired, the calibrated now I'm talking about, and then those tiles are packaged and shipped off. Whereas the rectified, like I said, there's that extra step of squaring them and cutting them so that every tile is almost the exact same size as the other tiles in that line. And so we'll come back to this idea when we talk about grout joints, but I wanted to just introduce it to you here. So for a rectified tile, you can see the cut edge and you can see the square corners, whereas calibrated, it's not going to be quite as exacting. So let's move on now to large format tile. I like to talk about large format tile because that's kind of the trend now, is the tiles have been getting larger and larger. We almost never see 6 by 6s and 12 by 12s anymore. We still see them, but if you're on the cutting edge, you're probably speccing tile that's at least 12 by 24 for commercial projects or residential even, and in many cases much, much larger. So the threshold is where a tile becomes a large format tile is 15 inches, okay? If a tile is greater than 15 inches on one side, it qualifies as a large format tile. Now, what does that mean other than, oh, it's a large format tile? There are certain things you have to do as a designer to address the size of it. And as the installer also, there are certain challenges that go along with large format tiles. We even have tiles today as big as 5 feet by 10 feet. And this slide is out of date already. I only made this slide a few months ago. We're seeing tiles now closer to 6 feet by 12 feet, tile panels, we call them, 6 feet by 12 feet in a single porcelain tile panel coming out of Europe, primarily Italy and Spain. And you can get them from almost any of the American manufacturers as well. And some of them are even being manufactured here in the States. So that would be a different category. This would be called gauged porcelain tile, and we'll get into that in a minute. But here's an example of this ultra large format gauged porcelain tile in use in a lobby. So if you want that really clean look, the super large format, very few grout joints, so it's low maintenance and it's really contemporary, gauged porcelain tile panels is what you might want to specify. Now, let's look at some of the issues that any large format tile is potentially prone to. Now, I'm not talking about gauged porcelain anymore. I'm talking about conventional 15 by 15 or 16 inch by 16 or 12 by 24 tile. So the tile that you spec every day, if it's larger than 15 inches, it may be warped. okay, as an effect of manufacturing. And the warpage is a challenge to deal with in the field. The tiles may be difficult to keep lippage under control. Part of that has to do with the warpage. Part of it has to do with the substrate that might not be flat or plumb. Lippage, it could be caused by a number of factors. The bonding pattern, in other words, the orientation of how you put those tiles together, is more restrictive when you're dealing with a large format tile. You can't use any bonding pattern you'd like to use. There's certain bonding patterns that large format favors over others, and I'll get into each of these in more detail. Grout joint width. Generally speaking, as a tile becomes bigger, its dimensional variability is going to change more. So you're going to get more variation, and that variation is taken up in the width of the grout joint. So you cannot have these razor thin grout joints. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and I know everybody likes very thin grout joints, but large format tile, you're going to have to generally live with grout joints that are a little bit wider than you might like. How much wider? We'll talk about, okay? The larger tiles need to have full adhesion and full support. In other words, full coverage of thin set mortar. And we'll talk about what full coverage means. It could mean 80%, it could mean 95%, depending on if it's a dry area, an interior non-wet area, or a shower, or an exterior, it would require 95%. But it's very important that large format tiles be supported and adhered with enough thin set. And we're going to talk at length about floor flatness and wall flatness. There are some very straightforward criteria that you should know as designers. So before we move on to the next section, I wanted to kind of tease an upcoming change in the IBC, the International Building Code. And it has to do with how large of a tile can you adhere on an exterior. From 2009 to today, we have in the IBC a maximum limitation of 3 square feet per unit. Okay, so that means you can stick a 16 by 16 tile or a 12 by 24 tile on an exterior of a building. Now, back in 2009, when this was introduced in the IBC, those were pretty big tiles. Today, our tiles have gotten bigger. Our thin sets and setting materials have gotten much, much stronger in shear bond strength. And our tiles, not only have they gotten bigger, but they've gotten thinner. So we can have huge tiles today, but they're relatively light. So what the IBC will be publishing, and this is a done deal. We worked for years to get this, and we have it, and it's been voted and it's been approved unanimously by the International Code Council. So when the 2021 code comes out, the IBC will allow tiles as large as 9 square feet for any tile that's thicker than 1/4 of an inch, okay? For tiles that are thinner than 1/4 of an inch, and there are plenty of porcelain tiles thinner than 1/4 of an inch, those tiles are allowed to be as much as 17.5 square feet per unit. So we can stick a 3 foot by 6 foot nominal tile, and I'm not talking about anchored or rain screen, I'm talking about fully adhered direct bond porcelain exteriors. So this is going to open up all kinds of opportunities for designing with ultra large gauged porcelain tile formats. And all right, so let me move on to the next section, which is, why don't we talk a little bit more about gauged porcelain tile, because I want to tell you a little bit more about what it is. It's an ultra large and ultra thin material, or it comes in different thicknesses. Primarily it comes in 3 millimeters or 5.5 millimeters, but we're starting to see even thicker ones, versus about 3/8 of an inch is what a conventional tile would be. So to scale, if these gentlemen on the screen are 6 feet high, this is going to be roughly a 6 foot by 12 foot piece of tile, and that would be to scale. And you can buy this today. If you cut that tile in quarters, that would be the size that the IBC is allowing in 2021 to be adhered. So the standards for GPT and GPT panels, gauged porcelain tile panels, are 137.3 for the material and a 108.19 for the installation, for the interior installation of the material. And you can get those standards from ANSI, you can get them from the IMI, send me an email and I'll be glad to point you in the right direction. Now, the exciting news is that the same folks that wrote the ANSI standard A108.19 for interior installation are, and I'm on this group, are now writing a standard for exterior installation. And it's going to be called A108.20, and it's being balloted right now in the ANSI committee. We've been working on this for about the past year and a half. It doesn't exist yet. It's still in draft format. So you might say, well, what about that picture? We're looking at installers installing these mega pieces of tile, and you just said the standard doesn't exist yet. And that's true. You can design outside of a standard. It's done all the time. It may not be a good idea, and you have to be very careful, and you should be very conservative. But in this case, the standards are conservative, and so the standards have kind of lagged behind what's actually being done in the field. This picture, actually I downloaded this from LinkedIn, but it's a restaurant being built this week in the suburbs of Chicago. And this is a tile that is, oh, I wrote it down in my notes, 40 inches by 117 inches. So this is groundbreaking stuff, and this is really exciting for the tile industry. So speaking now to the thinness of gauge porcelain tile panels, this is an ideal characteristic that makes it easy to go over existing construction without demoing what's there. So on the left example, you have this very dated looking shower, and on the right-hand side, you see that old tile was just covered with new gauge porcelain tile. What a difference, huh? And you can save a lot of money by not ripping it out. Here's another example. This is the Admirals Club in O'Hare Airport. Personally, I like terrazzo, but whoever's in charge of redoing all the Admirals Clubs wanted to cover the terrazzo with something that they thought was a little bit more contemporary. So this is an example of GPT panels going in on the floor over an existing finish. And then here we have an anchored parking garage in an anchored application, so it's not adhered, it's set with aluminum channels. All right, before we get, I don't want to get too deep into gauge porcelain because there's a lot of other things we need to talk about. Gauge porcelain is still kind of a specialty material. It's on the expensive side, but it's very, very nice. All right, so let's talk about something that every job has. Every job has grout joints. The question is, how thin can you go with a grout joint realistically and expect your installers to do a good job? And the good news is that the ANSI standards are very clear when it comes to defining what the grout joint width is. And so let's go through the ANSI standards very quickly. There's a little bit of math involved, but it'll be painless, I promise. So the ANSI standards tell us that our starting point is 1/16 of an inch. Okay, but that's misleading. We have to read the whole paragraph. It says also that the actual grout joint size shall be at least 3 times the actual variation of the facial dimensions of the tiles supplied. Okay, well, how do you know what the variation of the facial dimension is? So when I say the variation of facial dimensions, what that means, let's say it's a 24-inch long tile. That 24-inch long tile nominal may be manufactured to 23 7/8, let's say, for example. So what we're expecting to be 23 7/8 may be a little bit bigger than 23 7/8. It may be a little smaller than 23 7/8. And that the big tile may be right next to the small tile in the installation. So you have to kind of look at the plus and the minus. So how do you know what that variation is? That's information you get from your tile supplier. And I will tell you also that you get what you pay for. So if you spec a premium tile, okay, then you can be pretty confident that you're not going to have a whole lot of dimensional variability. If you go to a big box store and get something that's lower end residential grade, you can expect more of a dimensional swing. So you get that from your tile manufacturer, what that value is. But what can they sell you? What can they make? So this table, which comes from the ANSI A137.1, is really for the manufacturers. And this tells you that for rectified tile, this is table 10 for porcelain rectified, it tells us that the tile can vary plus or minus 0.03 of an inch, plus or minus 0.25% with a cap of 0.03 of an inch, okay? There's a different part of the table for calibrated. We're looking at rectified because I want to show you the best, the highest standard that there is. So in the table, it says the tile, we'll use the 12 by 12, for example, can vary plus or minus 3/100 of an inch. But that's, remember, that's plus, so that's about a 32nd. 3/100 is about a 32nd of an inch. But remember, it's plus or minus. So that's a total of a 1/16 of an inch variation. And if you remember back in the previous slide, what the ANSI standard says is you multiply the actual variation by 3. So what's 3 times 1/16 is 3/16. So what you were hoping was going to be a nice, maybe 1/16 inch wide grout joint is really probably going to be closer to 3/16 if it conforms to this table. It might be better, again, you would use the manufacturer literature. Now there's one other caveat, and that is if you lay your large format tile out with a 50% offset, like you see in the diagram, all right? So the grout joint breaks this tile at the midpoint, okay? First of all, don't do that. If you're using a large format tile, you should not be offsetting 50%. You should be offsetting only a maximum of 33%. And we'll look at why in a few minutes. It has to do with warpage and lippage. But the ANSI standard says that in this case, for rectified tiles, we start with 3/16 of an inch, or sorry, for calibrated, for rectified, we start with an 1/8 of an inch. For calibrated, we start with 3/16. And we add the warpage. Okay, so we're talking about grout joints again that are wider, that may be wider than what we like. Okay, so the last slide I'm going to show about grout joints before we move on to the next topic is grout joint alignment is more important than the uniformity of the width of the grout joints. Okay, so spacers, it's a common myth that spacers are going to help your installation. They're probably going to do more harm than good, because what spacers in a tile floor do is they force the grout joints to be all the same width. And that's probably not what you want. You want the grout joints to vary ever so slightly in width because you want to keep them lined up. Okay, so remember the walls in the room are not always square, they're not always parallel. The tiles, as we've already discussed, are not always going to be the same size. So the grout joints are the equalizer. And if you force the width on the grout joints by using spacers, you're going to end up with results that are probably not very desirable. There's a big difference between skilled, qualified installers and the other ones who are not skilled. Who may rely on spacers and then get undesirable results. All right, so let's kind of springboard into bonding patterns. I mentioned that no offset is okay, 33% offset we're talking about large format tile. 33% offset is fine, or it can be fine. 50% offset, be careful. Okay, build a mock-up, make sure you review it for lippage and for warpage, because the tiles may be warped. The manufacturers are allowed to have some warpage in the tile. And if you offset those by 50%, you're lining up the hump, the high point of the hump with the corner of the adjacent tile, which is the low point, and you may have excessive lippage. Natural stone is exempt from that restriction of the 33% maximum offset. Engaged porcelain tile is also exempt from that restriction because these materials are not warped. It is the plank tiles, ceramic tiles that are very long and thin, or porcelain tiles that are planks, that are notorious for being warped, as you can see in the pictures. So you can mitigate a lot of those problems by offsetting them 33%. I kind of like this picture, even though it's a terrible picture, but you can see a couple things going on here. This is not even a big tile. This is a 4-inch by 8-inch tile. And this architectural wall wash lighting is, you've got that drastic angle of light, which we're really not supposed to do. But you can see the terrible lippage. Even the best installers in the world are going to have a difficult time putting that tile up in a 50% offset. So one of the other toilet rooms on the same job, the installers offset the tile by 33%. Of course, they're just following what the architects or the designers tell them to do. So it wasn't a mistake that they laid it out in 50, or that they installed it at 50%. It was just, nobody really could predict the effect. So I don't even think it looks that great on the 33% example, but it does look better in terms of minimizing the lippage than it does on the 50%. And we'll talk a little bit more about architectural lighting and what we can do. Basically move that light back from the wall 2 feet is what you do. And that's not a part of any code. That 2-foot distance off the wall for the lighting is not a part of any code, but it's just it's the industry recommendation. So finally, this is kind of a catch-all to show you that there are a variety of different bonding patterns. We've been only talking about a few of the common ones, but any of those ones on the right side of the screen with the little triangle, the caution symbol, means that you're terminating a grout joint at the midpoint of the broad side of the tile. And if that tile is a large format tile, in other words, over 15 inches, then build a mock-up and make sure that the lippage is manageable. So let's talk about lippage and how much lippage are we able to tolerate? And if your answer is 0, I would say you have to be open to the real job constraints. There's always going to be a little amount that we have to tolerate. So the ANSI standard, though, is it tells us how much is acceptable, and that number is 1/32 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch, in addition to the inherent warpage. All right, so if the tile's warped, those numbers are on top of the warpage. It's either a 16th or a 32nd, depending on the type of the tile, the size of the tile, and the width of grout joint. I am about at the 50% mark, and I've got a lot of material yet to cover, so I'm just going to soldier through, and we'll save questions till the end if it's okay with you guys. So continuing on with lippage, there are a number of systems called lippage control systems on the market that uses physics to essentially force the tiles or the corners of the tiles to meet in the same plane after they've been set in the thin set mortar. These are very, very good and useful, especially for large format tile. Lippage control. Okay, we talked about this concept a minute ago, how the shadows are kind of exaggerated when you have the wall wash lighting, but the 24-inch location off the wall is going to be a better effect. Okay, whoops, all right, let us move on now to, we're gonna get a little bit more technical, and I think this is important because installation methods are, it could make or break your job depending on how good the installation is. So the ANSI standards tell us that there are basically 2 categories of installation methods. We've got the mortar bed methods. There are about 3 mortar bed methods, and there are about a dozen thin set methods. And it's just like it sounds. The mortar bed or the mud bed, those are the thicker installations. Those are when you're building up a setting bed of sand and cement, often reinforced with a 2x2-inch galvanized wire mesh in the middle of the mud bed. You're building that mud bed up a couple of inches. So it's very labor intensive, but it's good. It's a really good installation. It's very durable. It's, if the concrete underneath the mortar bed is not perfectly flat, that's okay, because the mud bed will compensate for concrete that's not flat enough. And you're adding stiffness to the floor also. So we're reducing floor deflection. It's expensive. Mortar bed methods are more expensive because they're more labor, and sometimes you have to depress your slab. So because of that reason, they're not used very often. They used to be, and mortar bed is still big on the West Coast. And if you go to Europe, it's still big in Europe, and laying tile in mortar has always been the traditional way to lay tile until, I don't know, 50 or 60 years ago or whatever, when the advent of thin set mortars came online. So thin set is generally, it's a Portland cement with a latex or a polymer modifier in it to enhance the chemical bond, to make that mortar really sticky like glue almost, to hold the tile in place. 3/32 to 1/4 of an inch after embedment is what we have with thin set mortar. Both of these methods are used for walls or floors, even though my example for mortar bed is the guy on the floor and my example for thin set is the guy on the wall. You can use either method for either application. So graphically, here's what a mud bed looks like. You've got your concrete slab. And what you might notice about this concrete is it's not flat, and I've drawn it not flat on purpose because in the field, concrete generally is not flat. You have to make it flat. So the membrane, which is the blue material, comes next. If you have membrane, I'm not saying every job needs membrane. Let's talk for just a quick minute about membranes. What type of membranes are there and what do they do? You can have waterproof membranes. And in fact, you would need waterproof membranes if it's a wet area like a shower or a steam room, or even an intermittently wet area like a locker room or a changing area. A lot of times you put a waterproof membrane to protect the structure below. You can have sound isolation membranes or sound reduction membranes if you're working with multifamily or hotels or something where sound is an issue. And the other one is crack isolation membranes if you're trying to prevent cracks in the substrate from telegraphing through to the finish. So there are many different kinds of membranes. And today you can get one membrane to take care of all those. I mean, you talk to the folks at, I'm not going to give you any manufacturer names, but talk to the folks who make the membranes, which are the same folks that make the thin set and the thin sets and the grouts in many cases. And they'll tell you all about their membranes. So next we have the 1.25 inches to 2.5 inches thick of sand and cement, 6 parts, or well, not 6, maybe 4 to 1 part, 4 parts sand to 1 part cement, or 5 to 1, maybe 6 to 1, depending on how thick you want your, or how rich you want your mix. And that's screeded on or floated. And if your area is large, then you put a reinforcement bed. Once the mortar bed is cured, it's hard like concrete, and you go back the next day and you can trowel thin set mortar and stick your tiles into the system like that. So that is a mortar bed application. Here's the thin set application. Now pay attention because this is a little different. You've got the same concrete that's not flat, but now you've got a step that we didn't see before. This is a concrete patch or a self-leveling underlayment. Some kind of material needs to fill in the low areas of the concrete. And then we have the membrane, and then we have the setting material, and then we have the tile. So this is a thinner installation. In many ways, it's a simpler installation, but it's also very critical that we make sure the concrete is flat enough to receive the tile. And I'll tell you about what the flatness criteria is. Let's see. I think I'll tell you right now. Yeah, let's talk about that next. So, we have to have substrate that's flat. And again, my examples are horizontal, but walls also have to be flat. And notice I'm not using the words level or plumb because that's less important. I'm using the word flat, meaning it's got to be in this, you know what flat means, in plane. Flat is important to eliminate lippage, also to make sure the tile stays bonded to the substrate. These are why we need flat substrates. So here are the values that the ANSI standards and the Tile Council Handbook puts forth. For any tiles that are smaller than 15 inches, the substrate needs to be no more than 1/4 inch in 10 feet from the required plane. For tiles that are larger than 15 inches, in other words, large format tiles, we're twice as strict. The substrate has to be no more than 1/8 inch in 10 feet from the required plane. So if the red dotted line is the elevator threshold or is the, that elevation that you want, this is what small tiles can go over, and this is what large tiles can go over. So what happens here is the tile setter, before he or she lays that very first piece of tile, they take their 10-foot steel straight edge and they just drag that thing across the floor in all different areas of the floor or wall, in all directions, okay? And if you can see 1/4 inch of daylight under the straight edge, or 1/8 inch in the case of large format, then they are not to tile that surface. They have to prep the concrete or whatever the substrate is. There are additional requirements for drastic changes of plane, no more than 1/16 inch in 1 foot. For small tiles, no more than 1/16 inch in 2 feet for large tiles. So this is taken in our training center. This is a mock-up that our tile instructors have built, and they've intentionally built it out flat so that the tilers get experience in evaluating and assessing floors that they are to lay tile on. So this would not be an acceptable substrate. Now this is a real job. This is a condo building, and we can see the elevation is 1/8 inch high in this spot, and we're 5/16 of an inch high over there. So really in just a few feet, we're 3/16 different. So in that case, it's a self-leveler that went on to correct the concrete. Alternatively, a sand and cement patch can be applied with a trowel. I don't really have time to go into detail on the Division 3, which is concrete, versus Division 9, which is finishes. Disparity, because there are two different tests for concrete flatness. I'll give you the highlights. The Division 3 is the concrete test for concrete. Division 9 is the one that I already just talked about, the 1/4 inch and 10, or the 1/8 inch and 10. I'm going to just skip a few slides. Because we don't have time to talk and I need to get to some other sections. So the main downfall of the ACI test in Division 3 is that this concrete is tested right after it's poured, within 72 hours of after the slab is poured. And certainly during that amount of time, not much has happened to the slab, and it is probably going to be flat. However, 28 days later, when the tile crew gets to the job site, that slab has cured, it's curled, unless there's a lot of bars up at the top of the slab, and it's a whole different situation. So the 1/4 inch and 10 feet, or the 1/8 inch and 10 feet for large format is a requirement that you should have in your spec, in the tile spec, okay? In the tile section. You can still have the Division 3 test, but we definitely, need to have both of those references. Okay, let's move on to coverage, and I'll show you a few failures and tell you what you can do to avoid failures, and then we'll get on to installer qualifications. The ANSI standards require 95% coverage for wet areas, 80% coverage for interior non-wet areas. The best practice and how you can achieve that coverage is if you trowel in one direction only. In other words, the example on the right is the correct way to trowel, not the one on the left, because if you go in different directions, that mortar will not be compressed, and what we want is those ridges to collapse. And if it's a large format tile, we want ideally the direction of the troweling to be parallel to the short side of the tile. All right. I'm going to jump ahead to installer qualifications, because this is, I think, you can get a lot of value out of some of these concepts. Not that what I've said till now isn't valuable, but this is really good information too that not a lot of people think about. They think if you spec a really good tile, then you'll have a successful project, and that's not the case. It's not necessarily the case. The other part of the equation is you have to have installers who are qualified. Okay, so what does that look like? The tile industry has gone to great lengths to try to define what qualified labor really is. And if you consult the Tile Council handbook, there's a list. And on that list, it talks about journeyman tile layers apprentice programs. Ceramic tile, folks, is a 6,000 hour or an 8,000 hour apprenticeship, preceded in many cases by a Department of Labor approved pre-job program. So it's a skilled trade, and you have to do it for 3 or 4 years full time before you're recognized as a journeyman tile setter. So it's not something that you can pick up on a Saturday morning at a class at Home Depot, where you can teach yourself how to lay tile. Maybe if you're working on your own kitchen backsplash or something, that's one thing, but it's very important to have qualified labor. So journeyman tile layer apprentice programs is recognized in the handbook. IMI Contractor College is a credentialing program that the handbook recognizes. The Trowel of Excellence certification program for tile contractors is another one. And then the final one I'll talk about is the ACT certifications. That's the advanced certifications for tile installers. So I know a lot of questions are coming through. I'm going to talk for about 5 more minutes, and then I'll get to the questions. So let me finish up this section. Master Spec has made reference to all of those things that you see on the screen. I'm not going to read it to you, but I am going to point out that the advanced certification for tile installers, these are specialty certifications that cover the specialty areas that you see in boldface there: mud floors, mud walls, membranes, showers, GPT, large format tile, grouting. So here's a screenshot of what a spec may look like. You're starting to see a lot of specs with references to qualified labor. Not only specs, but product literature. And I think this is very significant because people like MAPE. I'm using MAPE as an example here. MAPE doesn't want to sell their product just to anybody. They want to sell their product to people who know how it goes in and who know how to use it, because the chances for success are much higher. So in every product that MAPE makes, they have this language about qualified labor. The Tile Contractors Association of America has these manufacturers who actually give money back to contractors in the form of product rebates and incentives if they have a certified, if they have the certifications. Okay, so certifications is a cost savings because it's more of an assurance that the project will go well. So the last point I'll make before we get to questions is, and I think this will kind of come full circle because we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sorry if I've talked too fast, but this will kind of bring it home, is these specialty areas the industry has developed craft certifications. Large format tile installation, now we all know what large format tile is because I've said it a bunch of times, 15 inches, difficult to do. Membranes, we haven't talked too much about membranes, but every tile setter should really understand how a membrane gets installed, and it's not easy. There are a lot of requirements, a lot of nuances to membranes. So we have tile industry has a certification called the ACT certification for membranes. We have 7 of these. We have one for mud walls, we have one for mud floors, we have a certification for showers, we have a certification for GPT and GPT panels, because when you work with GPT, forget everything you know about tile. Gauge porcelain tile is a different animal. It's really the same material, but because it's so large, it goes in differently. And finally, grouts. So if you're a designer on this webinar and you have a project with extensive large format tile, or with 500 shower receptors, or with a bunch of gauge porcelain, and you want to make sure that these are installed the way they should be by qualified labor, we strongly urge you to put in your specifications ACT certified installers for showers or for gauged porcelain. Each one of them are different, okay? So here's the thumbnail for large format. The installers are tested on their ability to evaluate and flatten the floor, to install the tile with good grout joints with minimal lippage. We look for that 1/3 offset. We look for 95% coverage, and we look for a good finish. For membranes, we evaluate the installers on their ability to install a liquid membrane with an anti-fracture fabric embedded in the liquid per manufacturer recommendations, and a sheet membrane. Not only just the field of the wall or the floor, but returning it around the corner, tying in the membrane to the drain body, and working around the penetrations of pipes and other type of special conditions. Membranes are very complex. Mud floors, this is essentially an exercise in floating a floor. It's very difficult to float a floor perfectly flat and perfectly level, but we're challenging them to do it here. Not only that, but is the wire reinforcement in the center 1/3 of the mortar bed? Is the cleavage membrane overlapped like it should be? Is the reinforcement overlapped like it should be? Mud walls, essentially the same skill set on a vertical surface, with the added caveat of the inside and outside corner. So we have to be plumb here at the inside and outside corner. We also have to be dead on our dimensions. So from finished mud to finished mud has to be, no more than a 1/16 of an inch off, because in the real world, it matters. I always use the example of a swimming pool, okay? If a world record was set in the swimming pool and later on it was found that finished tile to finished tile was a 1/4 of an inch longer or shorter than what it was supposed to be, that record is thrown out. So tile setters work in very exacting dimensions because it's a finished trade, so it's important. Shower receptors, there are way too many things for me to talk about in showers. We could talk about showers for hours, literally. But a good tile setter will be very capable of its own variety of showers. Gauged porcelain tile also has many specialty skills. And then grouts and grouting, we test the installers on cement grouts, improved cement grouts, epoxy grouts, single component grouts, and also their ability to put expansion joints, which we haven't talked about today. Maybe we'll have some questions on expansion joints. Need to know that. So let me get to the questions, and before I do, let's kind of wrap up and say that I hope that now that I'm almost done, you have a new appreciation for tile, not only as a finished material that's durable and healthy and easy to clean and all that stuff that we need to consider in this post-COVID era, and we hope you specify it, but we also hope you specify and you at least appreciate the importance of qualified labor and the skilled tile installers and tile contractors. So with that, I'm going to move my question and answer box to my main monitor. So Raymond wants to know, how can you get a free copy of the handbook? Send me an email if you're looking for resource materials. My email is on the screen, sconwell@imiweb.org. Do you ever specify, Susan wants to know, do you ever specify marble tile and are sealants required for use in the bathroom? Yes and yes. Any recommendations? Does this apply to porcelain tile? Sealants, whether it's marble or other natural stone or ceramic tile, you're going to need to have movement joints, also called expansion joints, every 8 to 12 feet on interiors, or every 15 to 20 feet for, I'm sorry, every 8 to 12 feet on exteriors, every 15 to 20 feet on interiors, roughly, but also every change of plane. So if it's a bathroom, every inside corner where a wall meets wall or where a wall meets floor is a soft joint. So yeah, you need to have a sealant joint versus a grout joint at those locations. So you would want to refer to the Tile Council of North America method EJ 171. EJ stands for expansion joint. All the expansion joint details are under EJ 171 in the TCNA handbook. Michael wants to know, what causes and recommendations can you share for installing porcelain tile on elevator floors? It's fairly straightforward. Porcelain tile is not that heavy. Stone tile would be heavier, but you know, where loads are a factor, either conventional porcelain tile or gauged porcelain tile would work. One thing though for floors, we talked about gauge and how you can often get gauged. It's so thin, 3.5 millimeters thick. Well, I would say reserve the 3.5 millimeter material for verticals, for walls. For floors, we want to have minimum of 5.5 millimeter material, okay? Because floors take more of an impact load than walls. And that's a pretty commonly acknowledged number. All the tile contractor associations and all the labor associations will tell you use a minimum of 5 millimeter thick material for floors. What are the FF and FL levels? Eric wants to know. Floor flatness and floor levelness numbers associated with the requirements for large format tile. So good question. FF and FL, those designations are from the ACI test. That's concrete speak. And it's important to understand a little bit about concrete, but those are from the concrete. So the higher the FF number, an FF of, I think, 65 is considered a super flat floor. And that's great. You can specify an FF 65 all day long, but that's good, but it's not a guarantee that floor will be 1/8 of an inch and 10 feet. These two tests don't talk to one another. So you could specify a high FF or FL number and still have to prep your concrete, would be my advice. Margaret says, hi Scott, what is your opinion on groutable LVT peel and stick tile for low usage room? LVT is a branded luxury vinyl tile. Vinyl is vinyl. It will not compare to ceramic. If you're looking for durability and cleanability and low maintenance, you'd want to go with a hard surface material, which would be ceramic. So candidly, I do not like LVT. Marcy says, we've had reps present us with tile with locking systems. Oh, like a click flooring, no mortar required, installed over existing surface. What do you think about this type of product? I've seen that. It's got potential. We, as a labor union, we are open to, well, I'm not part of the union, but the bricklayers and allied craft workers, which include the tile setters, are open to all new kinds of technologies, including the mortarless tile systems. We have to be to survive as a trade. I mean, one of the exciting things about tile is, unlike brick masonry, which has been largely the same for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the The world of tile changes daily. We've had so many innovations and changes in the chemistry of the thin sets and the grouts, the size of the tiles, the equipment that installs the tiles. So this mortarless, it's one example of just a new innovation, and we love it. We love it. And Michael asked another one, understanding the quality installation is key. How important is breaking strength of a porcelain tile and specifying commercial flooring? Breaking strength is very important. We did not talk about scratch resistance or breaking strength or modulus of rupture. All those tests, there are half a dozen tests that if you really want to get into the technical nitty-gritty, you can contact me later and I can put you in touch with the different ASTM testing standards, but it is important. Shelley says, interested in hearing more about expansion joints. So Shelley, you and I will talk offline. Elaine says, could you talk about types of grout, cement versus epoxy, and sealing of cementitious grouts? Is it necessary? Does it prevent staining? I would defer to the manufacturer of the grouts. You can get away with not sealing in some, you can't just say you always have to seal cement grouts or you don't have to. It really depends. So I would say consult the manufacturer of the grout. Lisa says, any special considerations for handmade or artisanal tile that can have high variation? Yeah, and now you're getting to like subway tile or mosaic, really specialty mosaic tile. And there's an art to that. And there are installers who specialize in mosaic installation. And there are contractors who specialize in mosaics. So I would say choose your installer as someone who has experience doing the very fine detail work. Darcel wants to know, post-COVID, do you anticipate any maintenance challenges, perhaps coverings 2021? Everybody's interested now in how cleanable is a material. And, I had a slide and I forgot to put it in, but there's a magazine called Infections Today, and they interviewed a chemist and they were talking about how hard surfaces, and when they say hard surfaces, they mean hard through and through, not something that's soft to the core, but has a hard shell on it or something. I can think of an example, but these are very important to be able to combat germs because mold needs a place and microbes need a place to develop, and a lot of nooks and crannies and a place for moisture to sit. Moisture doesn't sit in tile, especially the porcelain tiles. These are very hard fired, impervious tiles. They're easy to clean. They're easy to keep clean. So I think there's going to be, and there is beginning to be now already, a new focus on hard surface materials, including ceramic and porcelain tile for walls and floors. Some new questions. No, I think I've handled all the questions. Interested in hearing more about expansion joints? Well, we've got about a couple minutes left. So let me click over to movement joints, and Blair, I will turn it right back over to you, I promise. These are the locations where we need expansion joints. This is the spacing I mentioned earlier, 8 to 12 feet for exterior, interior 20 to 25 feet. If it's under a skylight or a big, storefront, multi-story window, we follow the exterior spacing even for interior. So it has to be through and through. This is a cement board substrate, so we're looking for those movement joints to go all the way through the backing. It doesn't do you much good to provide a movement joint in a tile finish if it doesn't go through the backing as well, because it's all going to move. All right. I could go on, but Blair, I think we've covered a lot of ground. And again, I thank you for this opportunity that NeoCon and LuxeHome has provided to talk about designing with tile. I invite all of the attendees to please contact me. My email address is on the screen, and I will be glad to follow up individually with any questions you might have. Back to you, Blair.
Thank you, Scott, for that very informative presentation. It was fantastic. And thank you to all of you for attending today. Please check neocon.com for more information on upcoming programs, including the next program presented by LuxeHome, taking place this Thursday, June 25th at 3 p.m. on strengthening campus communities through food service design. Thank you. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.